I've been an architecture critic in Los Angeles for nearly 15 years, and in all that time, I don't think I've ever come across a building quite as inscrutable, as strikingly mysterious as this one. It's the Alice Millard House by Frank Lloyd Wright in Pasadena, one of 5 remarkable houses Wright designed and built in Southern California in the early 1920s. My curiosity about the house deepened when its owner asked me a few years ago if I wanted to see the inside. It was just sitting there empty, said the owner, a man who collected famous houses the way other people collect Picassos or Diebenkorns. I could even spend the night if I wanted. He'd just lend me the key. It was thrilling and a bit eerie to spend 24 hours alone in that house. What I remember more than anything is how much of a temple it seemed, inside and out, with its rows of pre-Columbian ornament, even how crypt-like. I mean, look at the place. It's not exactly warm, welcoming, or especially domestic in any typical sense of that word. It's something else, opaque and tough to read, tight-lipped. I started to wonder, why does the house look this way? Why did LA elicit this kind of work from Wright? I remembered a line by Brendan Gill, one of the architect's most perceptive biographers, who wrote that Wright's LA houses are better suited to sheltering a Mayan god than an American family. Was he right about that? And why a Mayan god? What was it about pre-Columbian architecture specifically that made it so attractive to Wright in those years? What you're about to see is the story of my attempt to find answers to those questions. As it turns out, the answers make up a story more fascinating and more complicated than I ever would have guessed. A story that even a novelist might complain was melodramatic and overstuffed, one involving a midlife crisis of epic proportion, a love affair, and a brutal mass murder. A story starring an architect who tried to reinvent himself, as so many other Americans have done, in Southern California, a place Wright would later describe as that far corner of the United States. The first thing to do in learning exactly how Frank Lloyd Wright wound up in Southern California seemed obvious. I had to go back to the beginning, to Oak Park, the suburb just west of Chicago, where Wright opened an office in 1893 after working with the acclaimed architect Louis Sullivan. Wright and his wife Catherine, known as Kitty, would soon have 6 children. I also hoped to sit down with some experts on Wright's work from that period. I began with a fellow architecture critic.
It's fascinating to watch his trajectory. I mean, he begins with a shingle-style house, the home and studio in Oak Park, and uses that as a kind of laboratory, a way to break out of the Victorian box.
Wright's home and studio, featuring a playroom with vaulted ceiling for his growing family, was really a declaration of war on traditional hidebound Victorian architecture. In the designs that followed, Wright produced a markedly new kind of house, the prairie house, that hugged the ground, with a horizontal momentum perfectly suited to the Midwest. In a series of houses just after 1900, Wright brought this type nearer and nearer to perfection.
You see that culminate, really, in the Robie House, this kind of great statement, which is, seemingly both grounded in the earth of the Midwest and flying forward like a ship with its cantilevered roofs. It's a tremendous statement of a house that seems both rooted and static, but also incredibly dynamic.
My next stop was to talk with a former architecture critic, Lee Bay, who now works at Chicago's DuSable Museum of African American History.
So in 1909, it provides an interesting break in his career because up until then, particularly the last few years, he's really had an incredible creative outburst.
In these years, Wright was beginning to move beyond residential architecture to larger projects.
If his career were to stop there, he'd be a legend. But as we know, he goes on beyond that.